everyone. Welcome to the Leadership Podcast, where our disagreements inform your decisions. I'm Will Atkins. I'm here with my co-hosts Thea Ali, Brett Miller, and Dion Dixon. And this week, we are discussing DOGE, the Department of Governmental Efficiency. And that was established by an executive order by President Trump. It's led by Elon Musk. And just in case you perhaps have been living under a rock and don't know anything about DOGE, haven't heard about it in the news lately, essentially virtually all civil servants received what's called a fork in the road email, where they were given an option to self-select to quit, essentially, and receive severance through, I think it's September of this year, 2025, about 9 months worth of severance. And then following that, whole swaths of civil servants were summarily fired, and then some of which were then tried to be rehired because they were accidentally fired. There were issues with getting the contact info for those people who were fired. There were issues about nuclear safety and Ebola and very important civil servants that had been fired that were needed to be rehired. And then also what we've also seen lately is essentially OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, requesting or requiring all civil servants to send them 5 bullet points of what they did that week. And many government agencies, when the first email came out that said, send us 5 bullets, many of the agency heads said, don't do it. Don't send those emails in. At one point, Elon Musk came out and said, if you don't do it, for a second time, that will be, we will interpret that as your resignation. You will be fired. And most, if not all of the agencies now have started to actually send in their 5 bullet points, which are being evaluated by AI to determine if what people are doing is worth it. So that's in general what's going on with DOGE, and I imagine we'll probably let's start off this discussion with just the entity itself. I mentioned that it was established by an executive order by President Trump, and it's led by Elon Musk. But exactly what is it? Is it a task force? Is it a federal agency? Under what authority is it operating? Is it even legal to be doing what they're doing? So, Dion, let's start with you. What is DOGE?
That is an excellent question, and I've actually listened to. There's a YouTube channel that I subscribe to called Legal Eagle, and he's a lawyer that does these YouTube videos about different legal cases going on. He's had his hands full with a lot of what Trump and Elon Musk have been doing, but he did have a video on this, and he kind of went through and said it's very unclear based on the verbiage in the several executive orders that are pertaining to DOGE. It's not just one. It was like 2 or 3 that were issued that subsequently followed each other up and changed slightly different verbiage in what people were doing and what they were their intent as an organization was. And so he said, well, if it's a federal advisory committee, then they're under these certain rules. But if it's just some sort of special government employee situation, those have their own rules and they're slightly different. If it's just a extra governmental advisory capacity, that also is probably not very legal. Like, there's so many questions about what is it exactly, and therefore what rules apply. And we don't, as far as I know, as of this recording, we don't actually have solid answers. Thea, have you been able to look into any of the legality of DOGE and understand what it might be and what rules might pertain?
No, because I think that it's hard. I think that it's hard to, like, I think the short answer is no, because for the reasons that you just said, right? And there's not a lot of transparency, and from the outside looking in, for me to understand, or for anybody to really understand what authority it's operating under, other than an executive order, right? And normally, executive orders, from a legality point of view, executive orders aren't meant to be standalone permanent documents for, normally they would be how I think the intent behind them is normally based on some underlying authority. It's meant to communicate how the executive plans to execute something, and so that's typically what you would see an executive order for. So like, we have, I'm trying to think of an easy example. I think emergency, state of emergencies, I think those are done by executive order, right? So the things like that, where you already have these underlying agencies, underlying statutes, and now the executive is making a declaration of what they're going to do. Here, you typically wouldn't set up a government, agency or department via executive order. Normally that would have come through an act of Congress. So I think we're really in the wild, wild west right now, from a legal standpoint. And I think it's, I can tell you as a lawyer, no lawyer has the right answer when something is this new. Like it takes time to kind of parse it out, and there hasn't, so I just don't, it's hard, which is really frustrating, because then it's hard to weigh in on the legalities of the agency.
And I think that's the point, like I feel like this was not by accident that, because you're right. If we knew under what authority DOGE was acting, then there are checks and balances that would apply to that authority. But if no one knows what authority, we don't know what checks and balances apply. And the conspiracy theorist in me says, not only is that by design, but if it comes out later that whatever was happening is illegal, Trump would just pardon Musk for doing those things. And I think that's why it's not, Trump's not in charge of DOGE. It's somebody else, so that Trump can then pardon whatever crimes happen to come out of it.
When I was thinking about it this week, the way I kind of view DOGE, and this is, again, I always try to give a very generous interpretation, so we can have a good discussion. I kind of look at it like a task force, right? Like as if the White House stood up some type of task force to address a problem. And I think that's like using language that we would be familiar with, the task force on X. So here it's like a task force designed to address government efficiency. I actually wish they would have used that language, because I think one of the things, because Trump comes from a background outside of government, and in particular because Elon Musk comes from a background outside of government, I think there's not an appreciation for sometimes using terminology that may be pre-existing to help get buy-in when you're trying to do something. So I really do think that's how this is probably functioning, is more like a task force that was specially stood up to address a specific issue. And so I'm not even that upset about the idea of DOGE. I mean, I think the name is stupid. I'm just going to say that. I think it's a stupid name, and the history behind it is stupid. But I'm not upset about the idea of it. Yeah, I'll just be honest. It's stupid. It's DOGE, whatever. But so I don't want to like get caught up in us arguing should it exist.
It's a cute dog, though.
But I mean, like, I think a lot of people are arguing about whether it should exist, but I think whether it exists or not, because I don't know if we would be having that argument if we agreed with, or if more people understood and agreed with the execution. So I think it's kind of like last week we were talking about, where do you attack or where do you come in and make the argument? And I think here it's the execution, not the idea or even the existence of DOGE. At least for me personally, that's where I have issue with it, as well as the manning and who's actually executing the work.
Yeah, because I don't think anyone would argue that in a government this big and complex that there's not fraud, waste, and abuse. And I think even just the four of us in the Department of Defense know that there's fraud, waste, and abuse to some extent. So the fact that it's a problem being addressed, or that this task force exists, in general, those are not necessarily bad things. But Thea, to your point, I think it's more about how it's being executed more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest thing that I've noticed is people have faults with the execution behind it. My research I came across, it's Executive Order 14158, right? It says that's where they renamed the United States Digital Service to the United States DOGE Service, created temporary organization. So you've got the U.S. DOGE Service temporary organization, and it's within the executive office of the president. So it kind of falls under his purview. But it is designed to be a task force. It's just not explicitly stated that way in the language. Mm-hmm. But, Will, to your point, when we're talking about, efficiencies and coming from our Air Force background, I mean, we've all heard the stories about golden toilet seats and $10,000 hammers. And I mean, Dion, you and I, coming from a background of working specifically in acquisitions, we've seen that stuff, right? Where you've got, just as an example, a $10 million budget for the year, but you're efficient that year. So you do everything within 7. And then the government says, well, next year, you're only going to get 7. You're like, well, yeah, but we've got things planned. We kind of need the 10. So therefore, we're going to go spend the $3 million on things that don't make sense just to make sure we get our budget again. That stuff happens all the time, which is why you've got, the Gallup poll, as of November 2024, expressed that, I mean, people are highly in favor of reducing government size. I think it's, 60% of the populace says, smaller government doing fewer things is a good thing. And it's got, decades of data to back that up from Gallup's polls. And I mean, and this isn't unique, right? Historically, we've got efforts to curb government waste. You've got Reagan's Grace Commission. You've got Clinton's Reinventing Government Initiative. All those kinds of things there. They've always been looked at favorably. So, I agree that, reducing government fraud, waste, and abuse is not a bad idea. But, even from my side of things, because, being that I'm kind of the representative Republican here, the execution is not ideal. There's definitely some issues that are there. I mean, some of the particular issues have affected my family personally and friends of family personally, so we've seen that. But I also understand from a business perspective, being a business owner, that things aren't always clean cut. It doesn't always work out the way that you want it to. Kind of anecdotally, my family, my grandfather owned an apple orchard, right? So when you're doing fruit farming and you're growing trees, you have to prune the trees, right, to get them to produce at their maximum efficiency. And sometimes what you do with that is you actually cut off fruit-bearing limbs. And you're like, wait, why are you cutting that? It's actually producing fruit. And the good farmer knows that in doing so, you'll actually make the tree better and stronger. So yeah, it's unfortunate we're seeing this stuff. I don't agree with the way some of it's being done and the lack of humanity that kind of goes along with it. But at the same time, and I think it's still too early to tell, but if we get to a point where we actually see some results and we do get some government efficiency out of it, but when we're only 2 months in, there's just a lot of, knee-jerk reactions, because you kind of have that where, it's kind of like little kids, right? When something moves fast, it startles them, right? And they scream and cry about it. And then once they figure out what it is, it's really not that scary. And I think that's something you got to say, like, you guys know me, like I love people, right? And it's one of those things that individuals are intelligent, people are stupid. You kind of have that group think, that mob mentality that jumps out and people just react way too fast. And usually you get scared and angry that's coming out of that. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with how this is playing out.
You don't see the knee-jerk reaction also being on the cutting side and not just the reactions?
Yeah, that's where I was.
I do.
I think that's, I think that the issue is the same kind of logic or like of your argument is where I think is causing some of the backlash to the cuts or the way that they're going about it, because it feels like the same thing, like a little kid came in and just started knocking things off the shelf because they wanted the shelf to be cleared, but didn't think of what it is that they're knocking down. And there seems to just be a lack of deliberation. And I think, okay, so all 4 of us agree that there are inefficiencies in government. There can be fraud, waste, and abuse. I think all of our opinions are informed from a collective, 20 plus years in government service, right? Each of us, right? But I think though I can also say, so as my career in the military, I was a personnel officer. And so I think you kind of alluded to it, Brett, when you talked about how money worked, so you'd have, base would have a budget. Let's say, I'm just going to use small numbers. Base has an operated budget of $1 million a year. That's not anybody's base. No base worked off of small numbers like that, but let's just use a round number. And what would happen was In personnel, we owned all of the people programs and a lot of the facilities on the base. We could never get 100% funded in any year, right? So like if the HVAC system for the base gym went out in June and we had done our budget since the past, the year prior, we were trying to like scramble for money and we would put that on our unfunded list, right? And so we were always shortfalled on our budget, always. And what would happen is someone on the other side of base, like you guys were talking about, would have have $10,000 for something that they ended up not needing, and at the third or fourth quarter of every year, my unit would scramble to get that money to finally get all our stuff funded that we really needed. And so I think a lot of people hated the budget process because they always thought it was inefficient. But for us, we called it fallout money, right? So when the money that wasn't spent, we could then scramble to get it to fill all these unfunded needs, right? So I only use that as an example, as a counter to this idea that, all this money just gets spent, because everybody doesn't get it 100% right in the year prior when you're doing your budget. Then when you have these surpluses, it just gets spent on nonsense. That actually wasn't my experience. 9 times out of 10, it was programs we really were hoping that would get funded for the next year. And it would actually make it more efficient for if we had fallout money for the current year to spend, because then we didn't have to go through all of the delay in getting certain, needs met. And a lot of times it would be big things that we needed for facilities and programs, again, they either weren't funded or there was a shortfall.
Well, I think you're kind of playing right into it, Thea, to where, again, it's the inefficiencies of the entire system, right? Because you do have the programs that end up spending that money because they have to, because their funding is set up where if they don't, they lose it. And you have programs like you ran to where you're unfunded from the get-go, right? Because, again, the whole problem is the inefficiencies. And, we need to look to adjust those. And that's what I'm hoping that over this time frame,
I guess I
agree. Out too.
I guess the reason I brought up the example, though, is I just feel like right now in the discussion, the assumption is we're spending too much money on everything and that everything is overfunded, everything is bloated, and that none of these things need to be it's not money well spent. And I think that while there may be inefficiencies, the presumption that everything the government spends its money on isn't worth spending is where I'm like, that's not true, right? And that's where the haphazard nature of just cutting things, like if you're sending out an email to all your employees and you're not looking at what these employees do, and you're saying, hey, we want everybody to take this deal, it assumes that none of the jobs matter, or that you can take the hit on shortfalling those positions, right? And again, having spent so much of my career in the military, having to deal with, we don't have enough fighter pilots, we don't have enough this, what are we going to do to, because they had done similar things without doing the numbers right, we ended up spending more money giving retention bonuses to certain career fields, going out of our way to try to spend money to keep people in or claw people back, that if we had just taken the time to be a little bit more deliberative in how we made those cuts, we wouldn't have to spend money on the back end to try to overcorrect for our problems. So that's where doing it quick without deliberation can cost more and be more inefficient in the long run. And that's where I'm just that's lessons that we've learned in government. It's not a new lesson. And so that's where it gives me heartache.
Speaking of efficiency, the reason why I brought up the legality and Will was talking about the legality in the beginning is because one of my biggest fears with a lot of what DOGE is doing is that we're going to end up over the next couple of years fighting court battles and spending a lot of time and money determining whether DOGE had the actual constitutional authority to do whatever it's doing, or whether the executive had the constitutional authority to do it. And so, one of the things that my biggest fear, because as we've all said, and especially as a libertarian, I'm all for hacking away at large parts of the government and getting rid of things. In fact, I have this quote in my Facebook profile that I really like to reference back to by Peter Drucker, who says, there is nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. And there are a lot of things in the government that I look at and I'm like, I don't care how efficiently you do it, government. I don't think you should be doing it in the first place. And therefore, let's cut it. But that aside, one of the grossly inefficient things that we could do to ourselves is to go through all of this time and effort and cost to start cutting away things that the administration thinks are no longer value added for the government, and then fight a years long legal battle only to have it then reinstated, right? That will have cost. There will be time that we didn't do anything effective with that time, right? Because the whatever was cut is in a state of limbo, so it can't act. And then we've spent all that time and money of other government employees either defending or fighting these legal battles that are surely going to happen. And so that is my biggest fear with the questionable legal stance that DOGE has right now.
I think, Dion, I think you're making a good point. I think you make a good point because it's basically, I don't think they're playing the long game, right? Because again, in order to play the long game, you need data to back up. And I'm normally not the data person, you're the data person, but you need data to back up your decisions and the things that you're doing. So I don't think right now the administration is playing the long game. I think you're absolutely right that it's likely that a lot of what's being done will be undone, or there's going to be a long battle that you're not going to see the effects of it because it was of the way that it's been executed. And again, would we have actually saved anything, or would we have made government better through this process? And that's where it's like, if the point is to actually spend less, be more efficient, cut the fat, then doing it in some haphazard way isn't, it just on its face isn't the right method.
I do think that's probably why they're going so fast. I think what they're hoping is if they can cut something and kill it quickly, that the inertia will be there then. I think we had this discussion before a while ago when we were talking about different government departments, but there is an inertia there. And once something has been dead long enough, it gets that much harder to resurrect it. And so that may be what the administration is trying to do, is just go really quickly, cut things off, let them die, and then it'll be that much harder, even through litigation, to resurrect them.
I think something to think about too with that, though, Dion, is looking at the level of things that they're cutting, right? When you look at the total government spending, the things that they've attacked so far, they're small, right? They're minuscule in compared to the larger budget items that are there. And I think some of that is a bit of, like you said, they're trying to move fast to make a point. But also, I think there's a little bit of, I don't know, first 100 days of an administration that's playing into it, where they're trying to make a scene. It may not be well thought out, but even if this stuff gets caught up in the legal battles, which I hope that it doesn't, right? Just again, for the waste that it would cause. But if it does, I think it'll amount to small things. I mean, ultimately, where we need to get to when we're talking about government efficiency is the big three, right? When you're talking about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense. And those are the big things that need to be attacked. Otherwise,
and the debt.
Yes, the debt as well as the interest that's on the debt. I mean, we're at 13% of our budget is spent on interest right now. That's huge, right?
Well, but one thing
I actually hope that we
I'm looking at
go to the legal side to the rule of law still means something. So if everything that they're doing is illegal, and I mean, Thea, as a labor lawyer, I wouldn't be all that surprised if most of these people get their jobs back, because it comes out that how they were fired, even if you had the authority to do it, the manner by which it is done could still make it like an illegal firing. So I would not be surprised if many of these people get their jobs back, and we're definitely no better off than we are right now.
Well, so Will, this is where I think, again, so I'm not a Trump fanatic, but I would say that anybody that underestimates their intelligence, also cunning, is probably doing themselves a disservice. And this is where I think they are being intelligent and cunning. As far as I can tell from my research, and it's a little bit hard because the media is all over the place in reporting this. but as far as I can tell, the employees who are being let go are ones who are on like probationary terms or whatever, which I think gives them a legal out, because when you're put on probation, it means that you are not guaranteed to have that job, that you serve at the pleasure of your boss because of this probationary
But your
status.
boss,
I
but
think
your
that's what
boss
they're doing.
isn't the president
Yeah,
or
I mean, so
Elon or
I think from okay, so for probationary employees, yeah, their rights are not as they're not necessarily ratified to the same extent that a long-term employee their rights would be. I think where the administration may find itself having problems is actually with their whole war on DEI and some of the language that they've used describing what they think are quote unquote DEI hires, because it can create a presumption that some of these people were being let go because of their identity, and things like that, which would be protected under the law. Without looking at individual cases, I can't completely speak to it, but I do think that it's not clean what they're doing. But the other thing is probationary employees are not going to get you to the numbers that they want. So at some point, so if we could, and I don't mean to say this in a derogatory way towards anyone who has been let go, but if right now, if we're quote unquote cutting the fat, at some point you're going to get to the muscle and eventually you're going to hit the bone. And I think if to get to the numbers as far as the dollar amounts that they're looking at, on the DOGE website right now, they have a letter board for like the agencies where they've done the most savings and cuts, and DOD is at 17. Right.
Mhm.
We know who the big, who the big kids on the block are when it comes to spending. And if their rankings DOD at number 17 as far as where they've done cuts, well, guess what? Right. Like that's not, you're
Right.
not going to hit the numbers that they're looking at, like what you guys were just saying, as far as spending goes, right? Programs and inefficiencies, like you got to hit some of the favorites in the class, the kids sitting in the front row that have been the teacher's pets, and you're not going to get there just firing probationary employees. So
and,
yeah, there, I think that's, yeah.
like when I look at the 70,000 from the VA that they're talking about cutting, like those are not
Yeah.
all probationary employees, right?
No,
Those are,
no.
and especially just because of the background of the four of us, like the VA has always been underfunded, understaffed. Things take too long to go through the VA system, and so sure, cutting 70,000 people is going to make a dollar amount go down. I would be interested to see, Dion, is the VA one of those things that you think the government shouldn't be involved in, because that's cutting 70,000 people from it is essentially going to do that.
Well, yeah, I don't want this to become a discussion specifically on the VA, but I actually had this discussion with one of my coworkers, because we're kind of, we work with the DoD, and so we're paying attention to this. It's starting to affect. I'm a contractor, but we have government employees in our building, and it's starting to affect them. The ones who decided to take the fork in the road, the first batch of them, their last day is this coming Friday. And that's going to affect some of the programs that we have going on in the office. So, anyways, we saw the 70,000 number or 80,000. I think it depends on what website you look at for the VA. And one of the things that we talked about was there are a lot of hospitals and clinics around that are civilian run, right? And so like I'm on TRICARE Select, which means that instead of going to the military hospital, I just go to a civilian doctor, and TRICARE takes care of that. And we were like, could the government save money by shutting down these VA specific hospitals and clinics and just allowing the veterans to do basically TRICARE Select, going to a civilian hospital or clinic?
Has anyone? I'm so before I make a statement, am I the only one who's actually gotten my health care through the VA on this? So because when I separated and I was in law school, the VA was my primary health care. When I had my son, that's how they paid for me like I was using my VA benefits for all of my healthcare for those years. And they had a select program similar. So at the time where, because the newsflash, the VA hasn't been good at providing women's health. So they didn't have OB services when I got pregnant and I needed to, have care during my pregnancy and then for my delivery and all that. So I did get farmed out and everything you're describing. And it was very difficult. I don't necessarily think it was more cost efficient because it took a long time for it to get approved. There were a lot of hoops to jump through. I ended up having a case manager that was assigned to me through the VA that had to monitor all of the care that I was getting on the outside in a way that I wonder, like, if I had just been going through the VA, would you have needed this person to then manage all my stuff? So I don't know if that's necessarily the best solution. I will say my mom just retired. I will say real quick, my mom retired from the VA. My mom was a nurse for the VA, and she worked at a VA hospital or in a number of different VA hospitals and VA clinics. And there's definitely a population of veterans that they do like the ability to go in there and get services from people who understand who they are, their background, their service. It matters to those folks. And the VA does a lot of good. And I do think that we are privileged veterans in who we are and just our backgrounds. And not everyone is at the level that we are. But even myself, like I said, I depended on the VA at a time in my life when I didn't have health insurance outside of that. And so I don't know. That's a rant that I'm going on as someone who has used these services, that I don't want us to speak to make light of what happens when you get rid of it and the impact that it has on our veterans, on a number of our veterans. Well, I would say
it, and I don't know if Brett or Will, if you guys have used TRICARE Select or whatever, but it has been virtually seamless for me. And I have not had any issues with payments or benefits or anything like that with TRICARE Select. So
the TRICARE is different than the VA.
Right. No, I agree. But what I'm saying is your issues with the VA paying to an outside clinic or hospital, I think are part of the Department of the Veteran Affairs internal bureaucracy, rather than just that the system can't work by paying out to private healthcare, because we've seen that TRICARE works pretty well for retirees and veterans, and
but it's a much smaller.
So it can work.
But TRICARE is a smaller. It's a smaller pool of people that are eligible for TRICARE between retirees and active duty versus the larger pool of veterans, right? And so I think that's something to consider. I think a lot of times we'll look at one system and say, well, look at how this works for this population, but then we don't account for what does that look like if then we're going to double or triple the size of the population that's using that service. Would it still work, or would we be able to do it the same? I don't know. But here's the thing, the conversation we're having, I don't feel like that's what's driving these cuts, right? I don't think that it's I think that's the issue that I have. I don't see DOGE based on their own, what they've communicated to the population. I don't see that it's like, oh, we're going to cut these things and replace it with something better. It just feels like we're just going to cut to save money without deliberation of how the services are still provided to the populations that need them.
I think it's one of the big things that's lacking is the transparency of it, right? I think people are okay with the cuts, but they really want to know, okay, what are you cutting? How does it affect people? What is the end result?
Exactly.
And without that information, especially when they're touting that they're going to be transparent, I think that's where people are starting to get rubbed the wrong way with DOGE.
Exactly.
So speaking of transparency, we should let our listeners and our viewers know there is a website. It's www.doge.gov, and you can go to that website and you can see what they are reporting they have cut. And like right now, I have the website up, and they are right now estimating a savings of $105 billion. That's where Thea was saying they've got their leaderboard, where DOD is number 17 right now. GSA is number 1 for the most savings found. But you can look on there, and when you actually click on them, you can actually look at like the receipts, the contracts. So like right now, if you go down to the contracts, the one at the top is the Bureau of Land Management, and they have the actual screenshot from the government accounting system that shows like what the contract was, what the contract number was, and what it was purportedly for, and its value and all that kind of stuff. So in that aspect, they are being transparent, but I think the part that is irking a lot of the public, and especially the government employees, is there doesn't seem to be a lot of transparency or like advance notice about this is what we're doing and how we're going to do it, right? So they just kind of show up, and then they just start looking at records and start announcing that people are fired, and everybody's like, what is going on?
And
so
and after
one
the fact,
one thing I'll say Tuesday. So our podcast, I know we're doing a podcast here and we probably shouldn't plug another podcast, but the New York Times Daily, their episode last Tuesday, they did a whole episode on DOGE as well. And they talked about that website. So my one caveat to it is one of the things that they pointed out was how many times that site has had to be corrected. So there have been things that are posted to the DOGE website and then have been turned out that the savings wasn't actually accurate, or the numbers weren't accurate. And so they are continuously correcting and improving. So again, giving them the benefit of the doubt that they're as they go, they hopefully will get better at their transparency. I would say they'll take some of those numbers with a grain of salt, because some of them have been pretty big, like have been debunked in pretty large ways, the things that have been posted to that site. So that's, it is what it is. So the numbers have varied. I'm not saying that again, when you go in there and you just cut, you can save money. The question is it in the long run, are those numbers going to pan out? At least for me, that's a question.
Yeah, and I think it was just, they're being transparent in theoretically what they're cutting, and kind of after the fact, they're putting it on the site. But then you're hearing a week later, after they've done the cut, they're then learning what those people do and figuring out whether or not they should stay cut or not, and do we need to bring them back? And
with those contracts too. So again, here's the lawyer in me. When you breach a contract, then there are damages, right? And then you have to pay to make that party whole, right? So I think with cutting some of these contracts, it comes back to what you guys were saying earlier. Are these going to, I guarantee you that some of these contractors are going to sue and say, hey, this was a breach of our contract for X, Y, and Z reasons. And the likelihood is that maybe many of those contractors will prevail, right? And then now we're paying restitution, we're paying damages to make to make up for whatever time that was lost, or things that happened to that contractor as a result of the cancellation. So that could be another way that it may look like savings today, and then 6 months, a year, 2 years from now, it's not. And so that's, again, why I do think there needs to be more deliberation and how we're going about this. The other thing I do want to bring up, though, because it's the thing that I have the biggest problem with, is I fundamentally have an issue with the idea that the person leading this charge has such a huge conflict of interest as themselves a recipient of billions of dollars in government contracts, right?
No. Trump said that he was going to recuse himself. It's fine. Whenever there's a conflict of interest, Trump said he would recuse himself, so it's okay.
Yes. I mean, and that's how we just trust people to do the right thing. That's just how it all works, right? Like, obviously, right? But that's the thing that I can't get past, right? It's not like it's just anybody, okay, yeah, he's a businessman or whatever, but he's a businessman that's directly benefiting daily by government through, government contracts. And so it literally is the fox watching the hen house right now.
Yeah, and it's difficult to and go ahead, Deanne.
What I was going to say, and like, I am most familiar with the space launch contracts that he has, because those are DoD. Like, I guess there are other contracts where they were going to lease Teslas and stuff. I'm not as familiar with those, but I will say this about the space launch.
Some of those.
Yeah. On the space launch side, like, I'm sorry, but it is not even close cost wise between SpaceX and like ULA and the other offerers. Like, I don't know if SpaceX continues to lose money or what, but they continue to provide. They have just an outstanding launch record, success rate,
But
and they're
but
providing a better
Dion, the
dollar
argument you're
value.
making, the argument you're making, it ignores the presumption that these contracts are worth us having, right? Because again, a lot of these cuts are being made from like a value space. I don't, someone who doesn't believe the government should be doing X, so therefore we're going to cut these contracts. And so the same standard would apply to SpaceX. You're making the assumption that yes, these contracts are they're providing a service that's needed, and therefore he's the right contractor for it. But that same standard is not being applied to other things, and so that's where it's still a conflict of interest for him, because he's not looking at the validity of the purpose of the contracts that are held by SpaceX or Tesla or any other company that he's affiliated with. And so that's where I think the issue becomes, because there's an assumption that SpaceX is providing a needed service. These contracts are needed, right? I'm not debating whether that's true or not. Yeah.
Yeah. In principle, I totally agree with you. But I mean, we either have to agree that space lift is a vital function for the government, or we have to agree that there's no need for the United States Space Force to exist, because without space lift, they would have no mission at all.
But then the same thing is true of so many other programs. That's the thing. It's
no, I get it. That's why I said I agree with you in principle. And it'll be interesting to see what they decide is and is not vital, critical mission in the DoD, because I think they're at the Pentagon now.
But they're not going to even look at it because Elon's got those conflict of interests. Like they're just
and that's
not.
The thing.
That's no one is going to make that determination, because that entire sector will just be ignored because Elon doesn't want to lose his contracts.
So this is something that, like, I was thinking. There is a cynical side of me that is wondering, is this just a dog and pony show? Like, are they like, hey, look over here, look at this distraction that's causing waves and everything, so that we can either, one, just continue to do business the way that we've always done, right? So if you look at Trump's first, we lost the. If you look at Trump's first term, he didn't, like, the Republicans did not cut the budget. They didn't cut the deficit. They didn't shrink government, right? Like, they continued on the path that it was. And, go back even further, George W. Bush, right? He did not, like, I've said this in previous episodes. I started off as a Republican, but one of the main reasons why I'm no longer a Republican is because I got tired of voting for guys who said that they supported smaller government, less government spending, and all that things, and then got into office and did the exact opposite. And so I kind of wonder, is this sort of a flashy token gesture of them saying, look, we're cutting, when we all know the $105 billion of savings that they're touting right now on the website. I mean, $105 billion is a lot of money, don't get me wrong. But when you're talking about a $6 trillion a year budget, it's a rounding error.
Yeah. Well, and it's, that is, to me, I do feel like it's more for show, and like one of the things that was kind of bothering me about it, at one point, because of DOGE, and this was a little bit surprising to me, but like because of DOGE, they were ripping out like the Tesla chargers from certain government buildings that were already installed and already working. So like when Thea was mentioning a lot of those, the contracts and the one that you were mentioning on the site, when the contract's half done, I mean, those are sunk costs that you can't get back, even if you end it. if you end up ending the contract and not getting anything out of it, that's just, to me, it's even more wasteful to not finish the project that you are already halfway, 3/4 away, whatever, through building. And certainly if you're going to rip out the stuff that's already complete just because you don't like electric vehicles, you know?
Yeah, I do know from my experience, being an acquisitions officer, I saw a lot of government contracts throughout my career. I do know from my experience, at least on the DoD side, that we got really good, especially in the past 10 years or so, about putting in clauses for uh, termination for convenience for the government. And so again, going with Thea's statement about let's try to steelman the other side so that we are arguing against the best version of them. I would hope that the ones that they canceled, in the middle of the contract would be the ones that had a termination for convenience clause for the government. That would be my hope.
I mean, that, which would take care of the legality of it, but to me, it still doesn't solve the wastefulness of spending on half of a project and getting nothing out on the back end.
Well, yeah, and so the hope, right? And again, it all depends on how the contract was written, but the hope would be you paid for half of the stuff and you get to keep half of the stuff, but you're no longer willing to pay for the other half. But you're right. There will inevitably be contracts where maybe the terms of the contract were that we were leasing equipment from somebody or whatever, and it wasn't government ownership. And so when the contract ended, the contractor was like, okay, I'm taking my ball and I'm going home.
See, to me, this conversation right here really leans into the thought that DOGE, the whole concept of it, currently, they're just treating symptoms, right? They're not actually getting to the root cause of the problem when you look at government inefficiency. From a business standpoint, you're talking through contracts, things like that. You realize sometimes there are sunk costs you put into things because you learn lessons from it. It doesn't mean that it was a waste. Yes, there's sunk cost that goes into it, but you are always approaching it from a for-profit mindset. You have to be looking to the future to create that. And the way the government operates right now, there is no for-profit mentality. Again, I mean, Dion and I have seen that specifically working in the acquisitions field in the military in the past. That's just inherent. And so when you have a workforce that does not have a for-profit mentality, you're going to struggle in that capacity. That's one of the reasons why the perception, I'd say, of the public of government workers is that they're, as a general whole, lazy. They don't do anything. They've got protected jobs, so they don't have to work hard. You have all these things that play into it. And I mean, trust me, I had seen it working in the industry that it was near impossible to fire a government civilian. I mean, there's so many hoops you have to jump through. Most of the time, it was easier to move them to a different program or promote them just to get rid of them. Right. It's a very broken system because you're never operating from that for-profit mentality. And that's where I really think there needs to be a fundamental change in how the government operates to start with. DOGE can do its thing, but if we don't fix that, we're just going to bloat right back up years later.
I 100% disagree that operating from a for-profit mentality is the answer, especially I think that varies depending on the mission of the organization you're talking about.
True.
Right.
Agreed.
So I'll use, you know what I mean? Because I don't think that we had good results when we started in a number of instances when we looked at government contracts for defense and under the Department of Defense, especially when we talked about actual like warfighting capabilities when they were farmed out to some of the government contractors, we got bad results. And so I do think it's important to keep that in mind, that some of what the government does is unique, right? And that the mission is different. And so, I work with for-profit, clients, right? I work with, I'm in corporate America. And it is a different mentality, right? And the mission is different. And every one of my clients has a different mission. And I have to understand whatever their business objective is and figure out how to understand their organization, their mission, and how their profits work. But the same is true of government, because certain agencies, it's not just about dollars, right? It's about the services that are provided and that we as a country have committed to providing those services for the people, right? So like FEMA would be, I mean, actually FEMA is not a good example, but I think, when we talk about, Medicaid and Medicare, the idea to provide, like, either it's kind of like what Dion says, either we are going to stand by those programs, and specifically Medicaid, and say that we're going to provide health care for underprivileged youth, or we're not. And yes, I think it's important to think about doing it in a cost efficient way. And I think there are definitely a lot of things we can look at. But at the end of the day, it's not just about profits, and you can't just look at that from a profit perspective, because you're basically agreeing to spend money for the care of children,
Yeah, and I
that's
agree
a
with
huge
you.
chunk of Medicaid.
I agree with you on that, Thea. And what I mean by that, just for clarification, is not that the government needs to operate to make a profit, but there is a mindset that goes along with it when you're looking at the best value to do things and operating practices. I mean, the example I give is like when you're continuing to hold on to an employee that has proven to be ineffectual, but that it's so hard to let them go that now you just move them to a different position. You continue to pay them rather than cutting that lost cost is one example, right? Because in private sector, a person who doesn't perform their job, they're gone. The government doesn't always work that way. And that's just a singular example, but it's approaching it with the mindset of how do we run the most efficiently we can with the mission in mind, right? And again, it's
Brett,
a different way to approach things.
Brett, why the government is really never going to operate efficiently is because the government is a monopoly. Well, yeah, it's a monopoly, right? So like if I am unhappy with the service that I receive from the government, there's not a competitor, right? I can't go, well, I'm going to take my money over to this government and give it to them, right? Like there's only the one. And by the way, if I don't pay them, if I decide, okay, well, there's no competitor, but I still am not going to pay you for the services that you're supposedly rendering me, well, then I go to jail, right? So it's a little bit of a lopsided establishment.
Yeah, there's no competition for these things, and so there's no reason for improvement.
And I agree, and I'll address the employee piece of it, the labor piece of it that you brought up. I definitely encountered the difficulty of firing a government employee when I was working on, especially my last base here when I was in LA, was notorious for there were just a handful of people that were just terrible performers, and it felt like it was impossible to fire them. And I one of my claim to fame is I did successfully get one of those problem children, terminated, but it took 2 years of my life, to get it done. So I agree with you on that. But I would say now that I'm on the other side, that's not necessarily unique to the government. I have a number of private sector employers that have run into problems also, because it's not that you can fire those employees. The government can fire them too. And what ends up happening is, this is why I have a job, they sue, right? And then the way to adjudicate their claims ends up costing a lot of money, taking a lot of time and manpower. So when I'm advising clients, I always have to try to make, talk to them about the costs, the pros and cons, and the costs that come along with terminating, a potentially litigious employee, right? And so the same is true on the government side. But I think that can be addressed, right? I think even when I was it was a lot easier to fire an employee when people actually built the case of performance, right? So when performance reviews were accurate, like one of the things that I had a huge issue with as a supervisor was this idea that everybody, and this was true, so to our listeners, there was this practice with government civilians that everybody got the highest rankings for performance evaluations, right? Right. Everybody got the highest rankings on the civilian side. And if you marked them down or had anything that was accurate to their performance, that was considered, you going after that person or whatever. So then the problem became, when you did have a problem employee, it was very difficult to accurately document their performance. And then because their performance always looked like it was great on paper, then when it came time when you wanted to fire them, you didn't have a historical record, right? So there was a lot of that I hope DOGE could fix stuff like that, right? Like that was cultural. That was because it made it so that you didn't have an accurate depiction of performance for your employees. That's never good. So
I don't think DOGE is going to fix that kind of stuff. That's the stuff that needs to be handled differently.
And that's what you said when you talk about the root of the problem. those are things, because no matter what, you're going to still have employees working for the government. And I do think one of the things that needs to be addressed is how do you quantify or qualify their performance to see who's doing a good, quote unquote, good job. And the way to do it, to me, is not to send them an email and tell me 5 things you did last week. And there should be an actual performance measurement system that's accurate. And in that sense, I do think the private sector does a much better job of evaluating employees, because they are incentivized to say, we don't want to keep people who aren't strong performers.
Yeah. And people need to be okay with being average when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Yes.
If you are doing your job description, you should get an average rating. Only when you go above and beyond, right?
Yeah. At law firms, I'll say at law firms, at big law firms, it's almost impossible. It's very, very difficult to get the highest ranking as an associate, right? So if you're an associate at a big law firm, and let's say, you're graded from a 1 to a 5, it's almost impossible to get a 5, right? You're kind of defaulted at a 3. You might get a 4, and if you get a 5, that's their way of saying, oh, we want this person to be a partner. And that is how, and I agree with that, right? So most people are average, and then you have the people who are above and below, but it is rare to see a 5,
So
and I'm just
Theo,
using
what you're
1 through 5
telling me is that your advancement is merit based.
It is, but it's also measured, right? It's measured, right? And it's where you can actually look at what that merit is, right? So one of the things that I have a hard time with, a lot of times people say they want things to be merit based, but then they don't pair it with objective qualifiers, right?
Yeah, you need a measuring stick. Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. So that's the thing. If you want things to be merit based, and you have to define what the merit is, and you have to have some type of way to show how people, like, where they fall on, whatever whatever the spectrum is that you want to create. And there seems to be an absence of that. There's definitely an absence of that in the government, even amongst military members. I mean, we spent years as officers changing the way we were being evaluated. It's like every year they were changing it, and I feel like there were a lot of resources that were going in, way more resources that were going into how to evaluate on the military side, on the active duty side versus the civilian side. And they still didn't get it right. And they still had problems. And I think we could probably do a whole episode that nobody would want to listen to about the officer performance OPRs and how to get promoted in the Air Force, right?
This is actually a great episode to talk about that. Speaking of inefficiency, the fact that I don't know how many combined hours between the 4 of us here were probably wasted trying to get rid of the white space at the end of a bullet,
at the end of your
on an
line
OPR
for
or
your
an
OPRs.
EPR.
Yeah.
Right?
If people only had
OPRs
GPT to write their OPRs.
Yeah.
So OPRs
for
being officer performance reports, and EPRs being enlisted performance reports.
Yeah.
And like, if you had even a tiny little bit of white space at the end of the bullet, that was seen as detrimental to that person that you were rating on. Like, you didn't care enough to take up the whole space to describe what they did for the unit. So that is like capital inefficiency for the government.
Well,
like,
and
hours wasted.
The way the form was designed is it had to be bullets. It couldn't be a narrative, so you couldn't write a paragraph. And then you had to try to get as much in those number of bullets. So it read like gibberish, because people would make all these crazy abbreviations. And again, you would have to fill in to the end of the line, regardless of what you could literally have said. Captain Snuffy saved 200 lives in this mission, blah, blah, blah. But if there was white space at the end of that bullet, it wasn't a good bullet. It doesn't matter the 200 people, you know what I mean? Like,
good old Captain Snuffy.
Speaking of bullets, I just want to say very briefly, the 5 bullets email went out that said, hey, tell me what you did last week in 5 bullets, or, and if you refuse to do this, I'll assume that's a resignation. And that went out from DOGE. I do want to say, and this may come off as harsh, but there were people that I heard complain simply about having to document what they did last week.
To someone that wasn't their boss.
No, I get it. I get it. But if your sole complaint is I should not have to tell you what I did, then we have a problem.
But I heard a lot of those complaints, but I felt like I was hearing it. I shouldn't have to tell Elon Musk what I did, because who the hell is Elon Musk?
Right.
That's what I heard a lot of.
Not my chain of command, not my boss. My boss knows what I did.
Not my boss, not anybody who knows or understands what I'm supposed to be doing. And then my personal, objection to it is to then plug that into some type of AI and then think that that's going to assess performance, doesn't make sense. People have different, we all know your weeks fluctuate of what you're working on. Right. And so I just think, again, what is the outcome? I
don't think that was the actual intent. I think the purpose was to find the people that had been kind of shirking their duties and hadn't responded to emails, or people that were still receiving paychecks that weren't employed anymore. I think that's really what that was. And I also think a lot of the stuff that OPM is doing is not targeting DOD specific stuff. I think it's meant for some of the other agencies. I don't know, but
when you send it to everybody, you're gonna then like it. Because I laughed the minute before I even heard about how like the CIA and FBI and different agencies, that they were told not to respond. The first thought I had is, if someone's job is secret, and now and the things that they work in a secret world, right, where most of this stuff is read in and all that. Are they supposed to just respond that I was working on intelligence for blah, blah, blah to this, non-encrypted? Like, to me, that just sounded like a problem, and luckily then it was, I hate to give Tulsi Gabbard credit to then tell her folks don't respond, because now you might just be like, creating this whole security problem because people responded to that email, so that's the thing. It's the execution.
I talked to two people this week that were in that exact situation where what they do is classified, and they can't even give you an idea of what it is that they do, because even the topic is classified. So they struggled to send in the 5 bullets, and then, Theo, to your point, to be put into an AI where we just saw that the AI got rid of pictures of the Enola Gay because it said gay. Like, unless someone is actually like a human being is reading these things, and even if it is a human, if they don't know what that job is supposed to be doing, like, you can't make a real assessment on whether they're being effective or efficient.
And that's why I was saying, I don't think that was the actual intent, was to assess your actual job, because there's no way that they could know that. I think it was to root out some of the, like I said, the people that were not responding to emails at all and just skipping stuff.
But I mean, your point earlier that, people with being paid but actually weren't working, like, I can't, maybe I give the government too much credit, but seeing it from the DOD side, there is no way that someone who no longer works somewhere is still getting a paycheck. Like,
where I will tell you where from an employment side where that happens, and there's always a story behind it. Where it happens are people who are on extended leaves, military people. That happens a lot, right? So if you're under USERRA, you can be gone for 5 years from your civilian job, and it's protected, right? So you will stay on the books for up to 5 years if you're on orders, right? I don't think people realize how not necessarily getting paid, but you're on the books, right? You could be on the books. And so there are, whenever you'd pull the numbers, there's always a handful of employees in any organization that are in this weird status where they haven't fallen off the books yet. They're on some type of leave. They're in a probationary status. Sometimes you have people who are transferring in from another government agency. So having worked personnel for years, all of that is valid. It looks weird when you see it, but 9 times out of 10, there's some type of explanation for why that person's sitting there. And a lot of times they're not getting paid. A lot of times they're actually in we call it LWOP, leave without pay status. And so that's where it's like the little knowledge I have of how the system works, I push back on this idea that we had this large number of employees in the government that were getting paychecks and that weren't showing up to work. That has never been my experience.
I don't think there was a large number. And I'm not saying it was like a large number of any
sort. But not enough to warrant
but
sending an email like that out for that purpose to the entire workforce.
Well,
right?
we've already kind of discussed the fact that the tactics that DOGE is using right now are not going after the big ticket items anyway. Right. I think they're just making a loud noise. But, coming back to my point, it's all these little things that are done. It's not going to matter anyway, because even if we make big cuts to the big entities, if we don't change the mindset of how the government operates, again, we're going to balloon right back up to where we were within a short order. So again, we can't be symptomatic about things. We've got to get down to root causes of why does this actually happen? Yeah. And I personally think it's the method of operation. It's the mindset behind how we do things and how the government operates. But when you've constantly got a third party perspective of how you're spending money, right? And understanding third-party perspective, it basically means it's not your money and you're not the user of the product. So therefore, you care very little about quality and cost. That's just the nature of government spending. And so until you change that mindset, we're going to keep running into this stuff.
I mean, as all four of us as former government employees, did you feel that was true when you were doing their jobs in the military? What you just described, did you feel
to
that
some
was true?
extent? Yes. I mean, I think there are certain individuals that operate a certain way, but when you look at bigger agencies, again, Theo, this comes back to what we were talking about before, right? It depends on the mission, right? It's not just about the profit, but in order of the mindset, there were a lot of people that like, I don't care what it costs. We need to get it done, rather than, okay, we need to get this done. How can we do this the most effective way possible? Both, cost, schedule, performance. It's the three things that you always look at when you're running a business.
So, Brett,
and I think some of those get shoved.
To your point, Brett, whether it's a large number or a little number, we already have laws and regulations on the book. Like we all have, like for civilians, you have to certify their time cards. If someone is certifying a time card for someone who's actually not going to work, like that person should go to jail. Like those things already exist. We don't need to do all of this to catch the 10 people that are certifying ghost workers.
No, and I agree with you, Will. And that's why I'm saying I don't necessarily like all the tactic that DOGE is using. And that's why it's, again, the stuff that they're attacking right now, I don't think it's going to matter that much. The, 155 billion, I didn't do the math in my head. We're talking a $6 trillion budget, right? 155 billion. Yeah. So, I mean, you're talking spending $6 on a $60,000 a year income, like, to put it in kind of more relative terms, like it's $6. It doesn't really matter that much. That's not where the big stuff is.
I think the thing I find to be, and I already know that like Dion's like all taxes are bad, but I do find it to be troubling that there's all this attention on the DOGE side to say we have to cut spending and cut all this money. But it seems to be that the thing that that these cuts are going towards is to support than to cut taxes, right, at the same time. So we're going to reduce our revenue. And the way we pay for, I guess, reducing this revenue is by cutting our spending. But it doesn't, if the deficit is this big thing that everybody's so worried about, to me, you would stagger it, right? You would reduce your spending, pay down the debt, and then you cut taxes, right? And so to me, logically, if that's the thing we're really saying we need to really focus on, because we're going to, if we cut taxes, but we don't pay down the deficit, then that interest is still there and the government is still having on the hook to spend it. So that's where, again, it's like, well, what is this really for? Is this for the benefit of like the fiscal health of a country? Or is this for the benefit of whoever is going to benefit from those tax cuts in the short term? And that's where I really, I just don't buy that this is really about getting the United States, as a whole out of the, to reduce the deficit and actually get us to be fiscally stronger.
Yeah. It's something that moves us in the direction, but it's not the complete plan, right? And this is where you have to have that long-term perspective, like you're talking about, Thea, that this has to be a 15, 20, 30-year plan, which also means that honestly, we can't keep playing this left to right politics back and forth where we have one side, I want really big government, and the other side, I want really small government. And we keep fighting each other constantly because then every administration, we're just going to executive order our way out of the last administration and we're going to get nowhere. There has to be a better mindset that we actually need the general health of the country to prosper long term. And that's a discussion that I think people need to have.
The problem is that how this is being done guarantee you that if a Democrat wins in the next presidential election, this will all be undone because of how it's being done. If we were concerned about long-term health and making sure that the policy doesn't swing back and forth, like this would not be unilateral and being executed in an ham-handed way that it is. Like you would try to come up with some kind of way, get Congress involved so that both sides can buy into it. I mean, the way this is being done, there's no way a Democratic president leaves it in next.
Well, and I mean, I don't even believe that. I think if the minute it's not Trump, and it's not necessarily Elon Musk at the head of this, I don't even trust that a future Republican administration would necessarily keep all of this in place either, right? So,
Well, what if all of this
you know,
is just to kind of get the public on the side of saying, yes, let's cut this. Yes, let's cut this. And so you have more and more public
but
support.
you're not. But again,
The
but
bigger
making it
items.
Public's
painful,
not
but
agreeing
making
with it.
but making it painful
70%
for the
do.
public. No, I don't
In
agree.
theory,
Like,
but
I
not
think,
how it's being done.
but if the more painful you make it, right? That's one of the things we've heard Elon Musk say, that is going to be painful. We even heard President Trump talk about it might hurt a little bit. The more painful you make it, you're not getting buy-in from the public. You're not getting buy-in from the people as a stakeholder. And so even if you're looking at it from, if you're playing the long game and you're trying to win the hearts and minds, you're not accomplishing that either. And even if people may support, and it seems like polling does say people support the cuts, the same polling doesn't support Elon Musk. If you ask them a question about him and his role in it, it's very negative, right? For those same poll respondents. So how you're going about it could undercut the goal of what you do as far as public opinion goes, right? And so I think
I do feel that probably the reason why they're conducting this effort the way that they are is because it really has not worked any other way. And I'm kind of, when I was looking at REGO, the reinventing government that Bill Clinton did in his term, I'm kind of shocked that he was able to do that much, and I think only because there were enough Republicans back then. It seemed like there was not as much stigma about crossing the aisle and working with the other side as there is today.
I agree.
But other than that, we really have not had very successful efforts to try and cut government fraud, waste, and abuse in the past. And so my feeling on this is that they're kind of playing fast and loose with the rules and regulations because it's the only way that they could. Because if they tried to go strictly by the books, I think there is so much red tape there that they would never get anything done. That's kind of my fear.
I disagree with that only because they control all the branches of government in both houses right now. So I think a lot of the times, because like particularly when under the Obama administration, they ran into a lot of problems, like you said, because they didn't have bipartisan consensus. And right now, there's a lot you could probably push through without bipartisan consensus through different, legal tricks in the House and the Senate. So I think to not even try it, I don't agree with it. This idea that there's no other way that they could go about it.
So I think you're right in terms of number of seats, right? I mean, yes, the Republicans control both houses of Congress and they have the White House. However, I think there are a lot of career politicians who rely on the extra perks that you get from being an elected official to continue serving in that role. And I think that there are a lot of bastions of the larger government that they don't want to see topple because that will directly affect them. That's the cynic in me about big government, but I kind of feel like he won't be able to get a majority of Republicans on board to vote for this stuff because enough of them will say, you're going to start cutting into my finances now.
So Dion,
I'm just going to plug term limits real quick.
I would have preferred them to say, here's an executive order that changes the civilian, the protections essentially for firing. And then you just tell every single agency, it's a lot like sequestration was back in the day, right? You have 6 months to lose 20%. You choose, you figure out what can get cut and what can't. I have removed the restrictions on firing people. A lot of them probably would default to the probationary people, the last ones in or the first ones out, but then they could also get rid of the dead weight. In that kind of an instance, you're avoiding most of the BS that we're seeing here, but still achieving your end goal.
Well, I mean, but I think a lot of the cost isn't just the employees, right? You're talking about like how do you address the contracts, right? Because the money, what's going to save you the money is the spending, and the spending in this instance, for once, it's not just the cost of people, right? And so, like I said, I'm curious how they're actually going to get to big numbers because that's when the episode will be about how we cut in Medicaid, how we cut in Social Security, right?
Speaking
That's
of
how you're
big
going to get your big
numbers,
numbers.
That's a great segue, Thea, because we are running long on time. And so I do want to say this. Everything that we've been talking about with DOGE has not touched on health insurance, which is the biggest part of our budget every year. That's, Medicare, Medicaid. Hasn't touched on Social Security, defense spending, or interest on the debt. Those four things add up to 71% of our spending every year. So DOGE could cut basically the entire executive branch of the government, cut everything, Department of Education, Department of Energy, all of that, right? And we would not even get to 30% savings, which would not even take care of the deficit that we had last year in our budget. We brought in just over 4 trillion and we spent just over 6 trillion. And so, Thea, that's a great segue to us saying, like, DOGE at once is probably going too far and not nearly going far enough. And we do on this podcast, we need to talk about Medicare, Medicaid. We need to talk about Social Security. We need to talk about the deficit and deficit spending and stuff. So with that, I think we probably should get to what's making us happy before we lose all of our listeners on another long podcast.
Yeah.
Go ahead and start, Dan.
Who wants to start us off?
I didn't come prepared.
I can jump in on this one. So for me, what's been making me happy is just the weather. Honestly, we've got to a point now where we are now above freezing in Ohio. So even at night, it was kind of cool. We got to move our blueberry and our blackberry bushes out of the garage and back out onto the porch. So now they'll start growing because my 7-year-old daughter, she wants to be a farmer when she grows up. Like, she is dead set on that. So anything that we grow, she loves. So I'm excited about getting the chance to plant our garden this year too.
I say, Brett, be careful about being grateful for the weather, because last time I did that, then a huge natural disaster hit that same week. So knock on wood, no blizzards come your way. So, okay, I guess I'll what's making me happy. Again, I should do homework. I don't come prepared, but mine this week was, again, something simple. Daredevil Born Again premiered on Disney Plus. So I was a huge fan. I'm a big Marvel fan in general. But I was a huge fan of the Netflix Marvel run in the early aughts. And Daredevil was my favorite actually between Jessica Jones and Daredevil, they were my favorite of those shows. And I thought that they did really good. And then in around 2020, Disney Plus started airing Marvel shows again. And with the exception of a couple, the quality has not been particularly good. And so I was really, really nervous about them bringing back one of the Netflix shows now on Disney Plus, with them now bringing those characters into the Marvel Cinematic Universe and what it was going to be like. So I watched the first 2 episodes this week, and I was happy. I think it's of the same caliber, and as like an MCU fan, and the MCU has been struggling lately, it's nice to see a project that had, high profile, that seems to be good, at least the first couple episodes. So my little faith is starting to be renewed a little bit. I'm hoping this is like a sign of positive things to come for the MCU shows, and hopefully it will eventually translate back into the movies, because the movies haven't been the same since the Infinity Saga. Okay, that's my nerd.
I think we should try to get a sponsorship with that plug.
Yeah. But yeah, Daredevil Born Again. If you liked the original, I would say check out the first couple episodes. I won't do any spoilers because there's some big things that have happened, but I enjoyed it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the same actor, right?
Charlie Cox, I think is his name. Yeah, so the original
Charlie Cox.
Yeah. So they brought back the original actor, and Vincent D'Onofrio, I think, is the guy who's played Kingpin.
Yeah,
they're both back.
That was the highlight, that it kept the same actor, and then bringing D'Onofrio as Kingpin, because he's been in some of the other Disney Marvel shows.
He's back with that same kind of, excellent casting for both of them. So that's what made me excited to see. I think they're going to bring back the spirit of that with those two as adversaries. So it seems like it's going to be good. So
talking about keeping the same people, my wife and I, we watched the Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, like the animated one that's on Disney Plus.
Yeah.
And Charlie Cox did the voice for Daredevil in the show there too.
Yeah. Yeah. We watched that too. So same thing. So I'm getting excited for Marvel stuff again. So hopefully that's a good sign of things to come.
All right. Well, continuing the nerd train. So this past week, we finished reading the Harry Potter series, me and my son. And I do got to say, man, that series hits different when you're a parent. Like I was feeling like, I remember the first time I read the Deathly Hallows, right? And okay, spoiler alert for a book that's over a decade old. I don't even know.
Yeah.
Like almost 2 decades old now. A lot of people die in Deathly Hallows. And I remember reading it the first time, like, oh, that sucks, but war is hell, right? Just going through it. And this time going through it with my son, I was like, oh man, like I got to take a moment. Like this is rough. So we finished that, which was fun. My son just thoroughly enjoyed the series, is really enjoying watching the movies now. But then I said, oh, well, what are we going to read next? And he said, Lord of the Rings, and I was like, done. And so we're like 6 or 7 chapters into Fellowship right now. So we're on the nerd train.
Nice. All right. So mine was similar to Thea's. I had kind of transitioned to trying to read a whole lot of books. A friend of mine read 85 books one year, and I was like, how did you ever have that much time? And he was talking about audiobooks and just reading every night. So since then, I had been on a kick, and I was, I've been pushing 75 or so books every year for the last several years. And recently, I was like, why do I put myself through that? Like, I enjoy reading, but maybe not that much. So I kind of transitioned back to watching some of the shows, watch an episode or two at night. For me, it was Reacher that came out on Amazon, but I had been waiting for Daredevil to come out as well. So it was just nice. Reading relaxes me, but I think television shows, movies relax me even more. And with the current campaign, things have been a little stressful. So it was nice to just kind of turn your brain off a little bit and just watch a show. It kind of made me happy. So with that, we appreciate everyone listening or watching to our podcast. We really do try to give you different perspectives of some of the issues going on today, but even just, political philosophy in general. If it wasn't clear throughout the episode today, Thea and I are coming at you from the left on the Democratic side. Brett is on the right, a Republican, and Dion is the token libertarian. And, we really do hope that our disagreements can help inform your decisions. We try to provide perspective from our individual kind of political ideologies. So please like and subscribe and share us with your friends if you found something meaningful or good out of this podcast. And we will see you again next week. Have a good one.
Bye.